Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and welcome to a special Valentine's Day themed episode all about love in Agatha Christie. How's that for a topic? I am rubbing my hands in anticipation here, but first, I am thrilled to tell you that I wrote an article for agathachristie.com about Christie's transportation and travel novels. It just came out. You may have seen it in their most recent weekly newsletter. This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently since I just came out with my mystery novel, Loose Lips, which is set entirely on a cruise ship. You can bet I've got a lot of Death on the Nile references crammed into that story. I've got links in the show notes to the article and also to my book for those who might like to purchase it but haven't yet. Thank you so much to all of you who already have. I so appreciate your support. Also, I was fortunate enough to be interviewed about Loose Lips by two different podcasts, Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents and Books on the Go. I've linked to these interviews in the show notes, so check them out if you're curious. I also want to let you know about a new leg of my book tour that I have coming up. I will be heading to the East Coast of the United States for the first week of March. On Tuesday, March 4th, I'll be in Titcomb's Bookshop in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. On Wednesday, March 5th, I'll be at the Mysterious Bookshop in New York, which is a wonderful mystery-focused bookstore in Manhattan, owned and run by the mystery legend Otto Penzler. Very excited about that. On Thursday, March 6th, I'll be at the Avon Free Public Library in Avon, Connecticut. And then I've got two events that weekend, two cozy cons, cozy mystery conventions with other mystery authors, which my publisher Kensington Books has put together because they're awesome like that. The first is on Saturday, March 8th in Flemington, New Jersey, and the second is on Sunday, March 9th in Enola, Pennsylvania. Those two events are both several hours long, so those are great opportunities to come and chat and spend some quality time with me, if you would like. I'll be there for a while. I've included a link to my website with more details if you're interested, so please come out and see me, and I will keep you posted on a third leg of my tour yet to come, hopefully in more of the south of the U.S. I'm just roving around the country here, speaking to anyone who will listen about Christie and mystery, just the way you all like it. All right, enough about me. Let's talk about love.
Let's talk about love.
So I think maybe Hugh Grant was, in fact, talking about Agatha Christie's oeuvre when he said that
love actually is all around.
Because, oh my, listeners, do we have a lot of lovey-dovey stuff to get through on this special Valentine's Day themed episode of All About Agatha. Whether you love or loathe the holiday itself, I have gone out of my way to include all sorts of different types of love in this omnibus episode. So let's do it. Let's talk about that many-splendored emotion of love in Christie. But first, this is the point of the episode where I would run through a list of titles that get spoiled, ye old spoiler warning. But there are, quite honestly, so many of Christie's books that I'm going to be spoiling in this episode. I'm just going to go ahead and give a blanket spoiler warning. If you are worried about having any Christie title spoiled, any novel, any short story, then this is not the episode for you. Pause the episode, read Christie to your heart's content on this Valentine's Day, and then come back and we'll chat. So that's my spoiler warning. Okay, now that we have gotten that out of the way, let me just take you through my methodology here, because as even a casual fan of Christie, I think, can appreciate, there's just love up the wazoo. That's a technical term. Only licensed literary critics can use it. Love up the wazoo in the Christie canon. So instead of just going title by title or trying to do some sort of massive rankings grid that would have basically been practically as big as the All About Agatha rankings grid overall, what I decided to do was to come up with different categories of love and to recognize 3 titles per category: a bronze, a silver, and a gold medalist for each type of love. I tried to limit myself at the outset to 10 categories, which meant that I immediately came up with more than 10. But then I figured that 14 would be a nice number since this is February 14th, after all. And that is how I ended up with 15 categories. So 15 it is. 15 types of love. I do think this exercise is going to be quite illuminating in terms of the kinds of relationships and interpersonal dynamics that Christie portrayed. I think she had some interesting tendencies here, and it makes for a fascinating analysis, I hope, when we can do this sort of holistic overview. So let's get started with our first category, which is centrally featured love triangles. I'm starting with a big category here. Love triangles are key to so very many Christie stories. And in fact, they're so crucial and so numerous that I actually had to divide them into two categories: centrally featured love triangles and peripherally featured love triangles. So let's focus on the centrally featured ones. We really do have an embarrassment of riches here when it comes to Christie stories that hinge in a central way on the inner workings of a love triangle. Our bronze medalist here is Evil Under the Sun, and the triangle among Arlena Marshall, Christine Redfern, and Patrick Redfern. This is just one of our very best listeners. We think that Arlena is a predator here, feasting on the husband and victimizing the poor, defenseless wife. But of course, the husband and wife have been plotting against the pathetic Arlena Marshall all along. She is our ultimate victim. I cannot say enough good things about the way Christie turns the tables here on the emotional interplay among these three characters. She just upends our expectations entirely. It's wonderful. And on that note, let's talk about our silver medalist, which is the love triangle in Five Little Pigs among Elsa Greer, Caroline Crail, and Ammius Crail. Once again, we have the situation of the other woman, I'm using air quotes, seeming to split apart our married couple here. That would be the tempestuous Crails. But of course, the Crails are solid, and it's Elsa who is on the outs, and she is none too pleased about it. It's another brilliant subverting of our expectations. And you know what? Let's just bring our gold medalist into the discussion, because I'm going to say much the same thing about the love triangle in Death on the Nile involving Jacqueline de Belfort, Lynette Doyle, and Simon Doyle. This is what I love about this exercise that I'm doing, because once again, we've got a woman on the outside of a marriage who's trying to make trouble. And of course, the situation here is more complicated in that Jacqueline and Simon were an item when Jacqueline introduced Simon to Lynette. So this time, our sympathies are with the quote unquote other woman, which is why it ends up being so devastatingly shocking when we realize the marriage between Simon and Lynette was a ruse all along. Simon and Jacqueline were, of course, in it to win it from the very beginning. It's so interesting to me that when we break down these love triangles one by one here, they all sound kind of the same, don't they? Like, doesn't it feel like if you read these three books one after another, they would seem repetitive, given the similar love triangles structuring each of them? And yet, as many of you already know quite well, each of these books, and Christie Gems, all three of them, could easily be read one after the other without seeming like a retread whatsoever. That is how good Christie is, not only at crafting a puzzle, but crucially at adorning that puzzle with the literary elements of plot and setting and characterization and all the other magical writerly things that she does so well. So brava to Christie. I would wager to say that no one does love triangles as well as she. Okay, so I have a few honorable mentions that I have to, mention. And I will be brief with these as I go through each category because we have so much to cover. But just real quick, I have to shout out the two love triangles in the novella Triangle at Rhodes, the seeming love triangle and the actual love triangle. Also, Alfred, Evelyn, and Emily in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, Neville, Audrey, and Kay in Towards Zero, Henrietta, Gerda, and John in The Hollow, Mike, Elsa, and Greta in Endless Night, and there are so many others, listeners. Dr. Michelle Casmer and I just covered the one involving Alan, Isabel, and Jane in Within a Wall, for instance. There's also Philomel Cottage, which is a particularly dark spin on the love triangle, and the Quinn Satterthwaite story, The Face of Helen, where, let's just say, a spurned lover does not take kindly to his sweetheart's betrothal to another. Let me know if there are any favorites that you are incensed I have not brought up here. But before you do, let's review my other love triangles category. So let's move on now to peripherally featured love triangles. Since Christie peppers her stories with romantic elements so often, it's not unusual for love triangles to pop up in her mysteries, but for them not to feature in the solving of the central mystery as they do in the novels of our first category. So that is not to say that these love triangles aren't important or even mysterious in their own way. I mean, after all, there's nothing more mysterious than affairs of the heart. Am I right? So let's investigate. Our bronze medalist is the love triangle in the Sittaford mystery among Emily Trefusis, Charles Enderby, and James Pearson. Okay. So Emily is engaged at the start of the story to James. He is actually the reason that she gets involved in the whole thing and becomes one of the two amateur investigators in the novel. The problem is that James seems to be a bit of a dud, and we watch as Emily and the other amateur investigator in the novel, her co-sleuth Charles Enderby, spark and crackle together in that inimitable Christie way, growing closer and closer over the course of the story. It really feels like we're gearing up for a fabulous romantic rejiggering at the end of the novel. It seems as though Emily is going to jettison James and go for Charles. And yet, Emily insists at the end of the novel on sticking with James. I may have told you all this story before. I've been doing this long enough that I'm sure I'm beginning to repeat myself here. But I have a friend who I was with on a trip while she was reading the Sittaford mystery. This happened while I was in college, and she was absolutely incensed by the ending of this book. And for the sole reason of Emily going with James as opposed to Charles. She loved the mystery resolution. She had no problem with that. She actually partially guessed it. I can still remember her saying, I know it has something to do with skiing, even though she didn't completely connect the dots. I was so impressed with that. But she really hated the romantic resolution. I should mention that this friend is a big romance novel reader as well, so she just felt very, very cheated. And I kind of feel her pain on this. It bothers me that Emily ends up with James. But all this is to say that the love triangle element here, peripheral as it is a really powerful one. So that's our bronze medalist. Our silver medalist is the love triangle in 450 from Paddington, which concerns Lucy Islesborough, Brian Eastley, and Cedric Krakenthorpe. So this is an interesting case because we see the brilliant Lucy, who remains one of my favorite Christie characters, flirt hard with both these men throughout the book. And I realize that this is subjective, your mileage might vary, but I was hoping very much that Lucy would choose the dashing Brian Eastley over the obnoxious Cedric Krakenthorpe. Based on what had happened with poor Emily Trefusis and her two beaux, that's beau plural with an X, I had a sneaking suspicion that we were being set up for Lucy picking Cedric. But it's not actually resolved at the end of the book. There's even potentially the chance that Lucy ends up with our Inspector d'Histoire, Inspector Craddock. So this is perhaps even more frustrating than the situation in the Sittaford mystery. But upon doing some research into the matter for the episode that Catherine and I did way back when, I found out, courtesy of Dr. John Curran and Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, that Christie was indeed thinking that Lucy ended up eventually with Cedric Krakenthorpe. I guess it just never made it into the book, which is weird, or maybe Christie liked leaving it ambiguous. Let's always give Christie the benefit of the doubt. But are we seeing a pattern here, listeners? Of a likable and talented woman choosing the seemingly worse option? Well, let's see if that pattern holds with our gold medalist, which is the love triangle in, oh yes, Death on the Nile, among Cornelia Robson, Mr. Ferguson, and Dr. Bessner. And I have to give credit here to my good friend, Dr. Michelle Kasmer, for reminding me recently about the brilliance of this peripheral love triangle in Death on the Nile. I read out what she had to say about it in a recent housekeeping segment. But also, this is how good Death on the Nile is when it comes to love triangles, right? It's a double gold medalist for both central and peripheral love triangles. And this one really is a great one because we have the earnest and serious and thoughtful Cornelia butting heads with Mr. Ferguson, who is totally one of those angry young socialist types who we come across from time to time in Christie. And it seems like Cornelia and Mr. Ferguson are hitting it off in true adversarial romantic fashion. You know, it's all very Much Ado do about nothing, Beatrice and Benedict, etc. But then she's also getting to know this somewhat older physician, Dr. Bessner, who enjoys teaching Cornelia lots of things because she's such a good listener. Well, given our bronze and silver medalists in this category, can we guess who Cornelia chooses? Ding, 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 the elderly mansplainer, but of course. And she doesn't even care when Mr. Ferguson, the angry socialist, turns out to be a member of the aristocracy, because of course he is. That's just the kind of stand-up lady Cornelia is. She's a woman of principle. And I do think, to be fair to Christie, that the choice is less stark here, because both Mr. Ferguson and Dr. Bessner are kind of terrible, maybe? Michelle called out that perhaps Cornelia is making a mistake here and stepping into a Rebecca-like situation. I'll be honest, their dynamic always made me think of another novel, actually, which is Middlemarch, specifically Dorothea Brooke's disastrous marriage to the much older scholar Edward Casaubon. She thinks it'll be such a blast helping him with his work, and spoiler alert, it is not. I've also got one more reference up my sleeve, which is Joe March settling on, and perhaps settling for, Professor Bear at the end of Little Women. Not that Mr. Ferguson is Laurie material. He wishes, but you get my drift. Anyway, that is our gold medalist for this category. And I've got one honorable mention, which is a very similar setup in Death Comes as the End among Renasem, Kameni, and Hori. But you know what? We still have 13 categories to go here, listeners. So at this rate, my little confection of a Valentine's offering is going to be longer than my Mousetrap episode. So let's move along to our third category, which I am calling Tacked On Pairings. I have to say, this element of Christie stories is one that I've always remarked on from my earliest reads when I was a child, and it's the category I thought of right after love triangles when I was thinking about the types of love portrayed in Christie, so that's why it's coming next. There is no denying that Christie loves to pair off characters at the ends of her mysteries as a way of tidying matters. And you know what? Shakespeare loved doing that too. So did a lot of other authors. There's no shame here, no judgment, but there's also no denying that it's very noticeable in Christie, especially since these are often the lighter elements of stories with such significant darkness in them. So our bronze medalist here is The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and specifically the pairing of Cynthia Murdoch and Lawrence Cavendish. This is our very first Christie novel, of course, so I had to highlight the first time she takes two characters who don't get an awful lot of room on the page. Neither of them ends up being central to the solving of the mystery, and she just takes them and kind of squishes them together into a neat little package at the end of the story. Ta-da! Our silver medalist is Appointment with Death, which features one of the most pairing happy endings in the canon. We've got not one, not two, but three pairings here. Dr. Sarah King and Raymond Boynton, Carol Boynton and Jefferson Cope, and finally Ginevra Boynton and Dr. Gerard, which is a pairing that I will be revisiting later in this episode. Stay tuned. So with these three pairings, Christie manages to give us happy endings for three of these poor Boynton children who are so tortured throughout the novel. I have no problem with this. You could even argue that these pairings aren't necessarily tacked on, that Christie earns them, perhaps especially as relates to Sarah and Raymond. But I think there's no denying that we get that sort of all's well that ends well vibe at the end of this novel. But I'm really saving the best for last here with our gold medalist, which is, believe it or not, And Then There Were None, but specifically Christie's theatrical version of this novel, in which Vera Claythorne and Philip Lombard get their happy Hollywood ending. And it's not a surprise that so many of the film adaptations of this novel have used Christie's theatrical ending as opposed to the bleak novel version, where, just a warning that I'm about to reference an instance of self-harm, Vera shoots Philip and then hangs herself at the end of the story. This is a little different. Here they are not such bad characters, and they end up saving themselves and surviving their ordeal together. I love the historical factoid, which I'm not sure is based on anything real, so this may be apocryphal, but I love the idea that Christie realized that soldiers and people suffering during the Second World War needed not only to be entertained when they watched this play, but perhaps to be left with a little bit of lightheartedness and even wish fulfillment, which is why she changed the ending of the novel. Because you know what? We could all use a happy, tacked-on pairing every now and then, right? Okay, in terms of honorable mentions, there are simply too many tacked on pairings to try to name all of them, but here are a few that crossed my mind while I was thinking about this category, the runners up, if you will. We've got Jim Lazarus and Freddie Rice in Peril at End House, Hermione, Egg, Lytton Gore, and Oliver Manders in Three Act Tragedy, Stephen Farr and Pilar Estravados, though really Stephen Grant and Conchita Lopez in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, Adelaide Jefferson and Hugo McLean in The Body in the Library, Kenneth Marshall and Rosamund Darnley in Evil Under the Sun, Edmund Swettenham and Philippa Hames in A Murder is Announced. I mean, the list really does go on and on and on and on, but I shall resist the urge to go on myself and move to our fourth category, which I am calling
Let's get together, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let's Get Together. That was Hayley Mills, by the way, who sang that song with herself using double tracking technology when she played twins in 1961's The Parent Trap. Some of you probably prefer Lindsay Lohan's 1998 remake, which I also adore, but you can love them both. There's room in my heart for both of them. But the original really is great. I do encourage you to watch it. By the way, if you were thinking when that song was playing about Hayley Mills's starring turn in 1972's Endless Night as the naive young American Ellie, then congratulations, you are as Christie-addled as I am. Though you get bonus points if you were also thinking about her role as Miss Quinton in the admittedly horrendous 1988 adaptation of Appointment with Death, starring Peter Ustinov as Poirot. Miss Quinton doesn't even exist in the novel, but she's basically Miss Pierce. Anyway, this category is a different beast from tacked on pairings. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of this episode, so we are going to dig into our meat and potatoes here and spend a little time on this category. These are couples who come together over the course of the novel or short story, not as an afterthought, but as a fully fleshed out side plot, or in some cases, the main event. I think that Christie's depiction of the blossoming of love is a big part of what she did so well. It's characterization. It's also to some extent plot. So let's celebrate it. All right, our bronze medalist is Sparkling Cyanide and the relationship between Anthony Brown and Iris Marl. I love that I get to talk about Sparkling Cyanide right now. It has been way too long. So I remember making fun of this with Catherine when we covered Sparkling Cyanide, but there is a lot made of the romance between Antony and Iris, because Iris is convinced that Antony is still in love with her big sister Rosemary, but then Antony tells her, "No, when I saw you, it was like Romeo seeing Juliet for the first time after having courted Rosaline," because he sees her coming down the stairs, and I just never forgot that image, actually. It's totally cheesy. I'm not going to pretend like it isn't, but it's obviously memorable, and Sparkling Cyanide is just a very romantic book overall. So I think it deserves the bronze medal for this category. Our silver medal goes to the unnamed English lady at the Villa La Paz and Anthony Cosden, another Anthony, in the short story The Man from the Sea, which is from the Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection. So these two randy lovebirds met years ago, consummated their love, had a son, unbeknownst to Antony, and are now reuniting again when that son is fully grown. And as I make this next point, I just want to give everyone a heads up that I'm going to be talking about the attempt to take one's life. I don't want to make light of that. I know it's a very serious issue, so just be aware of that. It's notable, though, that when Mr. Satterthwaite meets this man and then this woman in the story, he meets them separately, they both tell him about their intention to take their own lives. They're both in a suicidal state of mind here. And of course, our Yenta, Mr. Satterthwaite, helps them connect and in this way move beyond their despair and essentially live happily ever after. I mean, Antony supposedly only has like 6 months to live, but our English lady is like, yeah, we're in love. We're happy. He'll be fine. It's just a gorgeous story, dripping in romance. It's one of my very favorites, and I know many of you love it as well. Our gold medal goes to Colonel Arbuthnot and Mary Debenham in Murder on the Orient Express. So this is a bit of a strange choice for me because it's not like these two have such a wonderful love story or anything, or even that their pairing is all that interesting or notable in the canon, but it really helps the unrelenting bleakness of this story that we have these two characters coming together at the end of it and moving on together. Murder on the Orient Express is obviously a brilliant Christie novel, and I think it really does deserve to be celebrated, and I'm so glad to be able to award it a gold medal. It's just with a little bit of an asterisk here, since it's so unrelentingly heavy and ponderous that this soupçon of romance just really helps. In terms of honorable mentions, once again, we would be here forever if I ran through every romantic pairing in a Christie story. But here are a few that came to mind while I was thinking about this category. We've got Virginia Revel and Anthony Cade, another Anthony in The Secret of Chimneys, Lady Eileen Bundle Brent and Bill Eversley in The Seven Dials Mystery, Lady Frances Frankie Derwent and Bobby Jones in Why Didn't They Ask Evans? And I'll just pause to note that those are all thrillers. And of course, the thrillers feature lovers coming together. That's half the point of them. In the same vein, we've got Hilary Craven and Andrew Peters in Destination Unknown, and Sir Stafford Nye and Marianne / Renata / Daphne in Passenger to Frankfurt. For my money, the romantic pairing in Why Didn't They Ask Evans is the best of the bunch, so extra shout out to Frankie and Bobby. We've also got Megan Barnard and Donald Fraser in The ABC Murders, Luke Fitzwilliam and Bridget Conway in Murder is Easy, Jerry Burton and Megan Hunter in The Moving Finger, because involuntary makeovers are so romantic, Audrey Strange and Angus McWhirter in Toward Zero, Deirdre Henderson and James Gordon Bentley in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, Arthur Calgary and Hester Argyle in Ordeal by Innocence, Mark Easterbrook and Ginger Corrigan in The Pale Horse, and then there are so many of Christie's short stories that feature all sorts of delightful romantic entanglements. Here are some highlights for me. I'm just going to list the titles. I'm not going to name the characters here. Please have pity on me. The Girl in the Train, A Fruitful Sunday, The Manhood of Edward Robinson, Jane in Search of a Job, and in particular, The Golden Ball, which is very hijinksy and romantic. I also have to give a big ol' honorable mention to what Catherine and I took to calling the Miss Lonely Hearts stories within the Parker Pine Investigates collection. These are the first 6 of 12 stories in that collection, where Parker Pine and his minions, Claude Luttrell and Madeline DeSera, oh, how I have missed saying those names, they try to fix the lives of these sad sacks who apply to them for help. So, of course, a lot of them involve folks getting together. There's the case of the discontented soldier, which is pretty straightforward in terms of a man and a woman finding each other, as well as the case of the rich woman, which is anything but straightforward, but also features a romantic pairing by story's end. And then Parker Pine brings people together in the second half of that collection as well. The House at Shiraz and The Pearl of Price stand out to me in this regard. And then finally, most of the stories in the Quinn Satterthwaite collection, The Mysterious Mr. Quinn, feature 2 lovers coming together at the end, as romance is, of course, a big part of the charm of these stories. At the Bells and Motley, The Sign in the Sky, The Soul of the Croupier, The Man from the Sea, The Dead Harlequin, The World's End. Those stories all have romantic pairings at their end. And then in The Shadow on the Glass, we get 2 for the price of 1, a love triangle and a romance kindled between 2 lovers who are brought together at the end. Leave it to those love-soaked Quinn Satterthwaite stories to pull off that feat. Okay, it is finally time to move off our let's get together, let's get together category. Thank you, Haley Mills, for your service. And move on to category 5, love rescued from the brink. And this happens so often in Christie. A couple who are on the brink of falling apart and who manage to save their marriage in spectacular fashion. And we end the story with this couple on a high note. Often, these are some of the brightest spots in otherwise dark stories where horrible murders take place. And given that Christie was a person whose own first marriage ended so disastrously, she of course went on to have a wonderful second marriage, but I don't think she ever really got over the breakdown of her first marriage. I find these plot lines to be particularly affecting. Okay, so our bronze medal goes to The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And this time we are dealing with John and Mary Cavendish. So Christie was doing this right from the start. And lest I read too much into her biography, I will just slow my roll here and note that this was obviously well before her first marriage fell apart, though perhaps not before she was beginning to feel it fray at the edges. Anyway, John and Mary are not in a great place for much of this book. There is some straying happening here in this marriage, a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding, and Christie really takes a lot of care to portray both their points of view and to bring them together at the end. It's very well done. Our silver medal goes to Sandra and Stephen Faraday from Sparkling Cyanide. We are back to Sparkling Cyanide. So the Faradays are a disaffected couple. They have been married to each other for many years when the novel starts. Stephen has strayed, and they just seem tired of each other. And yet, By the novel's end, they have come back from the brink and realized that they are, in fact, perfect for each other and madly in love. It's one of those plot points that's hard to describe or summarize. You kind of just have to read the book. But it's wonderful, and it was actually one of my and Catherine's favorite aspects of the novel. If someone were to ask me to talk about sparkling cyanide, I think that before I mentioned anything about the trick with the place settings at the table, which still doesn't totally convince me, I would mention the Faradays. It's just exquisite character work that Christie does in this book. Our gold medal goes to Caroline and Ammias Crail from Five Little Pigs. And maybe this is a cheat since I already put the Crails in the category of love triangle, but I think it's warranted because I am not referencing them now in relation to Elsa Greer. I think it's incredibly poignant when we find out at the end of the book that all this squabbling we've revisited between the Crails as these 5 witnesses have been recounting their memories of them. It's proof not of what a mess they were, but of how well they worked as a couple. To put it in modern parlance, the Krell's love language was breaking teacups and slamming doors. They loved to get a rise out of each other, and they always made up, and they were, dare I say, soulmates. And I feel like we all know couples like this, right? It just rings really true, and it's a really beautiful portrayal. Happy Valentine's Day, am I right? In terms of honorable mentions, we also get lots of cases of love rescued from the brink in the Parker Pine stories. No surprise there. The case of the middle-aged wife involves a wife trying to hold on to her straying husband, and she succeeds by story's end. Or I should say Parker Pine succeeds. We also see Mr. Pine try to pull off the same feat in the case of the discontented husband, where the roles are reversed. It's the wife who has strayed and the husband who wants to keep her. Alas, this one ends in disaster when the husband falls madly in love with Madeline de Serra, aka Maggie Sayers. But I mean, can you really blame him? Pine does manage to successfully fix an existing marriage in Have You Got Everything You Want? Putting a little spice into the life of a bored wife. I also have to mention that gem of a short story Accident here, where we're totally within our rights to assume that the Merrodines are a doomed couple, since Mrs. Merrodine is definitely a serial killer, having killed a previous husband and her stepfather. But wouldn't you know, the ultimate twist is that Mrs. Merrodine is actually madly in love with Mr. Merrodine, and she has no problem killing meddlesome ex-CIDs to protect that marriage. Let me say it again. Happy Valentine's Day, listeners. And then lastly, in terms of love rescued from the brink, we've got some Quinn Satterthwaite to discuss. There is a nice little tale of a married couple coming back together in The Coming of Mr. Quinn, which is the first story in the Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection. And I have to give a special shout out to Harlequin's Lane, the final story in that collection, which is extremely romantic but extremely sad. We're presented with this married couple who are on the rocks and who, judging from these other Christies, we expect to make it work in the end, but it does not end well, readers. It really does not. Even though you would be forgiven if you remembered this story for another, more successful loving relationship in it, which brings me to my next category, category 6, friendship. Because Christie doesn't just portray romantic love. Oh no, we've got platonic love up the wazoo as well. So let's discuss. I'm awarding our bronze medal here to Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. Obviously, the friendship between the ethereal Mr. Harley Quinn and the passive, weazened little Mr. Satterthwaite is central to these stories, right? Catherine and I joked on several occasions that they basically function like Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt, and the unnamed narrator, played by Edward Norton in Fight Club. It's unclear whether Mr. Quinn is human or even exists at all in our world, and in Harlequin's Lane, he seems to take on a more divine aspect at the story's end, but the key here is that Mr. Quinn draws out Mr. Satterthwaite. He helps him access those parts of his personality, his ability to connect with others, to see what's important, to act in those moments when action is crucial, which Mr. Satterthwaite was capable of all along. He just needed a little push in the right direction. And isn't that what friends are for? Okay, our silver medal goes to Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings. And I mean, when I mentioned friendship, didn't your head go to these two right away? It's the ultimate Christie bromance. And while some of this has to do with the wonderful character work of Sir David Suchet and Hugh Fraser in the Agatha Christie's Poirot series, there really is a lot to delight in on the page when it comes to the friendship between Poirot and Hastings. I should shout out the friendship bonds on that show, not only between those two, but among the foursome of Poirot, Hastings, Japp, and Lemon. Just exquisite. But back to the texts. I think people tend to conflate Poirot and Hastings with Holmes and Watson. I think Christie even conflated them early on in her career. But she diverged from Holmes and Watson very quickly. And the friendship between Poirot and Hastings is one of the key ways that the parallel doesn't quite hold. There's a lot more affection and amusement and ironic distance between Poirot and Hastings in the texts than there is between Holmes and Watson. Christie just has a lot of fun with these two, and their friendship, I think, is a big reason why we adore them as much as we do. And certainly a big reason why I adore them as much as I do. Okay, it is time to talk about our gold medalist in the friendship category, and I'm thrilled to announce that she is Miss Jane Marple, who has so many friends, listeners. And this, of course, makes sense since Miss Marple is without spouse or child. She has had an entire lifetime to forge strong connections with those in her community, not just the ladies she has tea with, Miss Hartnell, Miss Weatherby, and Mrs. Price Ridley. Those are more social friends, but real solid friendships with the likes of Dolly Bantry, who is her way into The Body in the Library and the entire second half of the 13 Problems. And also Cherry Baker, who first appears in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, where poor Miss Marple is being terrorized by Miss Knight. Cherry swoops in with her husband in tow to save the day, and they move right in with Miss Marple. Hooray! And then let's never forget, all those maids who Miss Marple trained, plucking many of them from the orphanage nearby, giving them their first taste of work and responsibility. It's just so obvious that Miss Marple is adept at making lasting and meaningful connections. And we see her cashing in on those relationships that she's made with those former maids. For example, in 450 from Paddington, when she stays with her former maid Florence. And then it goes both ways. In A Pocketful of Rye, when she goes into full-on avenging fury mode, when someone dares to murder her former maid Gladys. I mean, if Miss Marple is not a friend to Gladys, I don't know what she is, right? She also has no hesitation helping out her old school chum, Carrie Louise, and they do it with mirrors. And in seeing through the posthumous and extremely onerous wishes of her friend Jason Raphael in Nemesis. She is a good friend, listeners, a great friend. I honestly never thought of Miss Marple quite in this way until engaging in this exercise for this very episode. So it's a little bit of a revelation to think of her that way, but I'm so glad that I did because I think it helps me see the entirety of her life in a way that I hadn't before. Miss Jane Marple, a friend indeed for any friend in need. And you know, I already wished you a happy Valentine's Day, but for those of you out there who might be celebrating Galentine's Day, in honor of Miss Jane Marple, happy Galentine's Day. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Okay, let's talk honorable mentions when it comes to friendship. All my medalists here were for characters that spanned titles, but we do get some novels where friendship plays a key role in that specific story. In 3-Act Tragedy, we've got an oh-so-touching bromance between Sir Bartholomew Strange and Sir Charles Cartwright. These two besties, am I right? I mean, it depends on whether you're reading the US or the UK version, but the friendship between them ends up being key, both in terms of how the murderous scheme is pulled off by Sir Charles and why. So even though it's not a successful friendship, I think it's worth highlighting. Male friendship also figures centrally in the Sittaford mystery. Maybe don't use your bestie's mailing address for contest awards unless you're sure your friendship is solid. And then we've got an extremely vibrant friend group in Peril at End House. Drugs and friends don't really mix. Nancy Reagan was right all along. And once again, I'm going to bring up Death on the Nile, MVP of the episode, where Lynette's status as a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad friend is a key aspect of the story and of understanding what's happening here. Finally, there is probably no tale of friendship woe more heartbreaking than what we get in A Murder is Announced, where Letty Blacklock has to do away with her beloved old childhood pal, Dora Bunner, since Dora just can't keep a secret well enough. It's legitimately distressing, both to Lottie/Letty and the reader. And I know I just said finally, but I have one more. I actually want to end on a positive depiction of friendship in the canon, as opposed to a doomed depiction. And that is the camaraderie that exists among the members of the Legion that Poirot forms out of those who have been affected by the multiple murders committed by the would-be serial killer in that story. Sure, we get a romantic pairing out of the Legion, Megan Barnard and Donald Fraser. I already mentioned them in passing. But I think the intimacy that grows, for instance, between Mary Drower and Poirot himself is much more interesting and affecting, as is just the general camaraderie that grows among these peripheral victims. Just my 2 cents. The ABC Murders, a friendship story. Kind of a different spin, but I like it. Okay, let's move on to category 7, unrequited love, or 1 is the loneliest number. This is a little painful, listeners, but unrequited love is a sad fact of life, and Christie does not shy away from this fact in her books. Far from it. She uses unrequited love as a motive for murder a number of times, and this is the case for all the medalists in my category. So here goes. Our bronze medal goes to Kirsten Lindstrom and Jacko Argyle in Ordeal by Innocence. I have gone on record as not being the biggest fan of this book. I expected to like this book a lot more than I did when I reread it for the podcast. And while I am sticking to that overall impression, there's no denying that Kirsten's infatuation with Jacko is shocking and memorable, and I think an excellent example of a fairly straightforward unrequited love in Christie. Our silver medal goes to Miss Chadwick and Miss Bulstrode in Cat Among the Pigeons. Oh, my poor dear Chatty. Miss Chadwick idolizes the gifted and competent founder and headmistress of Meadowbank School, Miss Bulstrode, and it's so heartbreaking that Chatty gives into a moment of weakness and kills another teacher, Miss Vansittart, who seems to be about to step into Miss Bulstrode's shoes as the new headmistress of the school. Miss Chadwick just can't handle the jealousy or the rejection, and she snaps. But as is so often the case with such unbridled love, it can do bad things, but it can also do good things. And in the end, Miss Chadwick sacrifices her own life for Miss Bulstrode. She literally takes a bullet for her, and in this way, redeems herself, maybe? It really is rather romantic, the way that it plays out. With maybe just the faintest whiff of sapphic love. I mean, we are at an all-girls school, after all. And kind of sort of on that note, we are going to move on now to our gold medalist for the ultimate tortured, unrequited, and ultimately evil love, which goes to Clotilde Bradbury Scott and Verity Hunt in Nemesis. And when I covered Nemesis with friend of the podcast, Dr. Jamie Berntal-Hooker, we discussed how there is an ongoing debate as to whether Clotilde's love for Verity is more of a romantic same-sex attraction or, as I believe it to be, and from what I remember, as Jamie does as well, more of a possessive mother love. Because we see lots of examples of that sort of love in the canon, right? And don't worry, we'll get there later in the episode. But either way, I think it's safe to say that this is definitely a majorly unrequited love. Verity Hunt did not think of Clotilde as either a mother figure or a romantic partner. And I'm so glad to be able to give Nemesis a gold medal here on my love-themed episode, since I don't think there's another book in the canon that pays so much lip service to the idea of just how dangerous and damaging love can be. Clotilde's sin was loving too much. I just want to talk about one honorable mention, which goes to The Soul of the Croupier, where we get one of Christie's very best depictions of unrequited love. We have here a man who has spent his life in love with a woman who is very, very bad, both for him and kind of in general. And I know that we're not worried about spoilers on this episode, but on the off chance that you haven't read this one, I'm not going to be more specific about what happens. Just trust me, this is a heartbreaking story with arresting visuals, so give it a read if you haven't already. It does not disappoint. Okay, let's move on to my 8th category, which is ships passing in the night / love not meant to be. And this category is similar to unrequited love in that it's sad, but it's really not the same thing. What we have here are two characters who seem to be making a go of it, who might have been able to make it work, who we perhaps expect to end up together at the end of the novel, but in the end, it doesn't happen for them. Let's discuss. Our bronze medal goes to Anne Bedingfeld and Colonel Race from The Man in the Brown Suit. I cannot believe it's taken me this long into the episode to reference this early thriller of Christie's that Catherine and I both loved, because it is very romantic. Don't worry, listeners, I will be speaking more about The Man in the Brown Suit a little later. So I remember when I first read this novel, I was shocked that Anne Bedingfeld and Colonel Race didn't end up together. I felt so cheated. It was similar to Emily Trefusis and Charles Enderby in the Sitford mystery. I just felt very bad for Colonel Race, who seemed handsome and nice and lonely. I do think it's important that we should feel that Colonel Race is a viable option for Anne, so that when she does choose her man, we feel that she does in fact have a choice. More on that later. Basically, I just love me some young or young-ish Colonel Race. I had to include him. Okay, my silver medal goes to Eleanor Carlisle and Roddy Wellman in Sad Cypress. The way that Eleanor and Roddy are introduced in this book, we think it's a foregone conclusion that when all is said and done, they are going to end up happily married together. They just fit so well. They've been intended for each other for so long. They know each other through and through. And even though Roddy may have lost his head a bit over that Mary Gerard, she's dead now because she is our main murder victim, and all is going to be fine, right? But love is more complicated than that. And I stick to my assertion that Sad Cypress, despite having lots of puzzly elements and being a Poirot novel, is one of Christie's most Mary Westmacottish mysteries, and this is a big reason why. Though shout out to Dr. Peter Lord, who, unlike Roddy, seems to know a gem when he sees one in Eleanor. Good for him. Okay, my gold medal goes to Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Countess Vera Rosikoff in The Double Clue, The Big Four, and The Capture of Cerberus. Both of them, because why not? I mean, how could I do an episode on love and not mention the mastermind jewel thief, Countess Vera Rosikoff, who is definitely meant to be the Irene Adler to Poirot's Sherlock? Catherine and I actually did a Vera Rosikoff-themed episode in which we discussed Poirot's relationship with this extremely camp figure. It's a lot more interesting on the page, actually, than what you get in the Suchet series. This is the rare instance in which I don't think the Suchet series did justice to a character and a relationship on the page. Because really, could we ever expect any romantic intrigue of our Monsieur Poirot to be bland or straightforward? Quel horror, as Poirot and Catherine would say. In terms of honorable mentions, there are so many doomed couples that I could mention now, but here are a few. Jason Rudd and Marina Gregg in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, Esther Walter and Tim Kendall, not to mention Molly Kendall and Tim Kendall in A Caribbean Mystery. Also, the short story Swan Song from the Listerdale Mystery Collection presents an excellent case of a doomed love that gets avenged. And I have to give a shout out here to Mary Dove and Inspector Neil in A Pocket Full of Rye, because if I don't, I'm going to get an angry email from my good friend, Dr. Michelle Kasmer, who actually wrote to me in advance of this episode with the following, and I quote, "I know I remain the only person on the planet who is a Pocket Full of Rye fan." Not true, Michelle. But I vehemently stand by it. Please do remember that part of the reason is that it has one of the best Bacall/Bogart, Hayes/Addison, Hepburn/Tracy style romances in the whole oeuvre. The Neil Dove flirtation is one of my favorite things about a book I already love a lot. Okay, Michelle. I'm putting Mary Dove and Inspector Neil in the doomed love category rather than the let's get together category, for instance, since despite all that flirtation, their relationship hits a roadblock when it turns out that Mary Dove is a criminal. Well, I'm not sure I have the same love for these two or their flirtation as Michelle does, but I can see where she's coming from. And I'll say this. Often in Christie, a love is doomed because one of the two people in a couple ends up being a murderer. That's the case in the couples I just mentioned from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side and A Caribbean Mystery. And I'll go ahead and include the flirtation between David Hunter and Lynn Marchmont in Taken to the Flood here as well. But in the case of Mary Dove and Inspector Neil, she's only a blackmailer and a burglar, or one who aids in the burglarizing of homes. She's not a murderer. So our flirty fun isn't as marred in retrospect as it often is in Christie. Okay, I think I've fulfilled my duties to Michelle and can turn now to the love that exists between or among family members. There's actually a technical term for this love, as distinct from eros, which is passionate love, and philia, which is friendship. That word is storge, spelled S-T-O-R-G-E, so it looks like storge, but I'm told it's pronounced storge, and it means familial love. The more you know. So let's talk about some storge in Agatha Christie, and we'll start with a category I'm calling love from a sibling. So our bronze medalist here is Elephants Can Remember, specifically the sibling relationship between Margaret and Dorothea, aka Molly and Dolly. They both have married last names, but their original last name that they shared was Preston Gray. Molly and Dolly are half-sisters. Oops, I meant to say twin sisters. They're twin sisters. And even though this novel is by no means a favorite of mine, sibling love is central to the solving of the mystery in this story. It's Molly's devotion to the troubled Dolly that lies at the heart of the solution. So while this definitely isn't a happy depiction of sibling devotion, or even a terribly good depiction of sibling devotion, I think it deserves a mention here. My silver medal goes to Jerry and Joanna Burton in The Moving Finger. I mean, these two are such close siblings that the poison pen writer in Limstock wonders whether they aren't a little too close. I don't have all that much to say about Jerry and Joanna, except that they're very memorable. It's one of the first things I remember about The Moving Finger, which is not one of my favorite Christies. I know that there are many of you who like it a lot more than I do, but I enjoy Jerry and Joanna very much. My gold medal for sibling love goes to Iris Marl and Rosemary Barton from Sparkling Cyanide. I mean, if Death on the Nile is the MVP of this episode, Sparkling Cyanide is a close second. That doesn't surprise me, though, since our topic du jour is love, and that novel really is obsessed with love in several different forms. And, you know, it's striking to me how rarely Christie does focus on the love between siblings, given that we have so many siblings in her stories, because of course we do. I think it's just that siblings in a murder mystery are often feuding with each other and not expressing their love. But in Sparkling Cyanide, we've got the younger and gentler Iris, who is nonetheless determined to avenge her big sister Rosemary's death. She worshipped Rosemary from a young age, and that sibling devotion is a big motivating factor here, and it's really sweet. Even if Rosemary herself is kind of a pill and maybe not worthy of Iris's adulation. I mean, one's myopic or distorted view of one's siblings is definitely a thing, so I love that Christie makes use of it here in Sparkling Cyanide. Who knows, perhaps she was thinking a little bit about her big sister, Madge, and we know that she had lots of thoughts about her brother, Monty. Okay, in terms of honorable mentions here, shout out to all those crotchety brother-sister couples in so many Christie novels, the bachelor-spinster pairs. We've got Dr. Shepard and his sister Caroline in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Henry Morley, aka the dentist, and his sister Georgina in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, Owen and Amy Griffith in The Moving Finger, Superintendent Spence and his sister Elspeth McKay in Halloween Party. Usually the brother in the brother-sister pair is a medical man of some sort, but Superintendent Spence is an exception to that rule. And I guess actually in that Elspeth's last name is McKay, she's an exception too. She must be a widow, not a spinster. Christie just really liked to use characters like this throughout her career. And I'd say in almost every case, the sister is a force to be reckoned with. She tends to rule the roost. So those are some really great characters. I'm also partial to Ruth Van Rydock and Carrie Louise Saracold in They Do It With Mirrors. I mean, sure, Ruth is a little image obsessed, but she really does care about her sis. There are obviously a ton more siblings, listeners. Come at me with the ones that you just cannot believe I didn't mention here. I dare you. Oh, and I'm going to give a dishonorable mention to those no good Reynolds kids in Halloween Party. Okay, category 10 is parental love. The love of a parent for his or her child. There is a lot of this in Christie. It's something that has come up time and again on the podcast. I'm giving the bronze medal to Anne and Sarah Prentice in A Daughter's a Daughter. So this is the one novel that I'm referencing on this episode that I haven't actually covered yet anywhere. Not here and not on the podcast's Patreon account. The story actually began its life as a play, but Christie later adapted it into one of her Mary Westmacott novels, and it's all about the complex relationship between Mother Anne and daughter Sarah, their resentments, their understandings, their misunderstandings, their misery, their joy. There is a lot going on here between those two. I mean, the title comes from the phrase, "A son is a son until he takes a wife, but a daughter's a daughter all of her life." Ominous. One obviously can't help thinking of Christie's relationship with her own daughter, Rosalind, who was her only child. But that is as far as I'm going to take the conversation now. I will be covering A Daughter's a Daughter at some point soon on Patreon, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's a fascinating story. I'm going to give the silver medal to Lady Bess Sedgwick and Elvira in At Bertram's Hotel. I cannot believe that I am singling out this book in a positive way. I suppose I've become a Bertrologist, but I think the familial relationship shines here because throughout the story, Bess has been defined by the way she shirks her maternal responsibilities. She really shrinks from her role of mother. And then in the end, when Elvira really needs her, when she really is going to benefit from Bess stepping in and sacrificing, Bess does it. I think it's a rare instance of mother love portrayed positively. And don't worry, we'll get to the negative ones in just a sec. But first, let's consider our gold medalist, which is the father-daughter pair of Captain Arthur Hastings and his daughter Judith in Curtain, our final Poirot novel. Given that Hastings started out as a bit of a comedic foil to Monsieur Poirot, the doofus narrator who could never get anything right, it's really striking to me that in this final Poirot novel, published at the end of Christie's life, we see Hastings struggling in a really three-dimensional way with his headstrong daughter, who he really does not understand, but he really wants to understand her, and it's frustrating to him. It's a moving portrayal, and it's one that I think speaks volumes to the difficult nature of a parent's relationship with a child once that child has become an adult. I feel like you could do a really interesting pairing of A Daughter's a Daughter and Hastings and Judith in Curtain. There's a paper topic for someone out there. All right, let's talk honorable mentions. We've got Superintendent Spence and his daughter in Towards Zero. It's a very small part of the book, but it ends up being crucial in terms of Spence's understanding of another character in the story. And this is supra-textual, but let's not forget that Superintendent Spence's son makes an appearance in The Clocks as Colin Lamb. It's heavily implied that Colin is Spence's son, and then Christie confirmed this elsewhere, so we know that was her intention. I've always really loved Julia Upjohn's jolly rapport with her largely absent mother in Cat Among the Pigeons. Mrs. Upjohn is a non-possessive mother figure. And then I also have to shout out The Oracle at Delphi, a Parker Pine short story where a frantic mother is willing to pay any price for the return of her young son. Fortunately, Parker Pine is there, albeit incognito, to ensure that no villain is able to take advantage of this woman's storge, her parental love. And I would be remiss if I did not mention Murder on the Orient Express again. The reason it's not a medalist here is that poor Daisy Armstrong's parents are dead. That's part of the motivation for the revenge plot. So the love that all these characters have for her and her memory is storge, but it's not parental love per se. There are also so many more here to choose from, so let me know if you think I've missed anything big. And unfortunately, this is one category where there are also too many dishonorable mentions to count. So many possessive mothers in Christie who would do better just to leave their children alone. We've got, of course, the monstrous Mama Boynton in Appointment with Death, Rachel Argyle in Ordeal by Innocence, and even Carrie Louise Saracold in They Do It With Mirrors, who seems to show either too much or too little affection for her offspring. She doesn't really get it right till the end of the novel. And I would argue that Clotilde Bradbury Scott belongs more squarely in this category than any other. There's also a really good argument that I should have made Bella Tanios from Dumb Witness one of my medalists here, since she really does commit murder for the sake of being able to leave her husband and have full custody of her kids. And probably the best thing I can say about that novel is the surprising nature of the reveal that Bella is the murderer, since she really only has been depicted vis-a-vis her children, but that ends up being the entire point. So that's clever. Shout out to Dumb Witness. I also just have to note that I was toying with the idea of doing a category for filial love, i.e. the love of a child for his or her parents, but we don't really have a lot of that in Christie, right? Obviously, we have the opposite of that in Crooked House, and I think that shows why it's a bit of an awkward fit in a murder mystery. I think it's hard to make a child's love, a true child's love for his or her parent into a compelling motive for murder, or even the investigation of murder. Even in novels like Five Little Pigs and Elephants Can Remember, where we have a child who's looking into what happened with his or her parents, that motivation is usually coming from outside. It's coming from someone else who's trying to meddle for whatever reason and get to the bottom of things. We don't really have a situation like we have in Sparkling Cyanide, where it's this familial love of a sister that's motivating the investigation into what happened to her. I just thought that was interesting as I was thinking about it. Though now I'm having fun trying to imagine a loving version of a Josephine character ending up being the murderer in a Christie-esque mystery. Anyway, let's move on to category 11. We're entering the home stretch here, listeners. Let's talk about love of animals. We all know that Christie loved animals, dogs and horses in particular. I already did a big dog-focused episode. I will be coming out with a cat-focused episode, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this category because it's a bit of a retread, but I couldn't fail to include animal love, platonic animal love, I hasten to add, on this list. It was just too important to Christie as a human, but also as a writer, and I know that it's important to a lot of people out there, so I didn't want to dismiss it. I'm going to give the bronze medal to Amy Carnaby and her beloved Pekingese Augustus, who are featured most centrally in The Nemean Lion, within the Labors of Hercules collection. I could go on for days about the genius of both the human and the dog in this pairing, but I won't. Listen to my dog episode if you'd like to hear me wax poetic about them. My silver medal goes to Lavinia Pinkerton and Wonky Poo from Murder is Easy. Poor Miss Pinkerton was so worried about her cat on the day she ended up murdered, and wouldn't you know, her worry was justified because not only was the cat subsequently cared for by Lavinia's murderer, Honoria Wainfleet, but poor Wonky Poo was made to be the unwitting accomplice of one of the most disgusting murders in all of Christie, death by infected cat pus. I will never forget that one, listeners. And then my gold medal in this category goes to Joyce and Terry the Terrier from Next to a Dog, which is such a heartfelt and heartbreaking story about a woman's love for her dog. I won't go on much about these two because I don't want to start crying, but let's just say the love is very real between them. We also get a human mate for Joyce by the end of this story, but perhaps that's beside the point. I covered this short story on Patreon if you are interested. And I'll just say for an honorable mention, which is a preview of my upcoming All About the Cats of Agatha Christie episode, that we need to discuss the strange case of Sir Arthur Carmichael. Do not cross a cat, listeners. Not in real life, but not in Christie either. Or else a fate may befall you, such as the one that befalls Lady Carmichael when she dares to mistreat a household cat. This story is also covered on the podcast's Patreon account. Catherine and I discussed it a while back for one of our spooktacular Halloween episodes. That's how spooky it is. Okay, let's move on to a different kind of love entirely, which is love of real estate. Catherine Brobeck and I talked about this all the time. Christie loved her real estate. And if you read her autobiography, it becomes immediately clear that her childhood home of Ashfield was extremely important to her. And we see that love play out a few times in the canon. So my bronze medal goes to the Listerdale mystery and the love that Mrs. St. Vincent has for the ancestral home of Anstey's, which she is so bereft to have had to leave when her family falls on hard times. Fortunately for her, good times are just around the corner. True story, but Catherine Brobeck always cited this episode as the one where she cried when we recorded it. And I believe she did so when we were talking about real estate. That tracks because Catherine loved infrastructure and urban planning and houses. So love for houses is very real. I'm going to give the silver medal to Lady Lucy Anketel and Ainswick in the novel The Hollow. Here, too, we get lots of rhapsodizing about a beautiful family home, and we never actually go to the home in the book. I love that because it makes the house that much more ineffable and magical, and I think Christie intended it that way. It's like the real estate version of the Krails in Five Little Pigs, who get colored in by others even though we never actually see them for ourselves. And do we see a pattern with Anstey's and Ainswick? Could they possibly be stand-ins for Ashfield? You might think that my gold medalist in this case would be Postern of Fate, where Christie goes full bore on the Ashfield reminiscences. But I'm actually going to go for Mike Rogers and Gypsy's Acre in Endless Night. And this is certainly a dark and twisted version of real estate love, but the love is real here as well. And as usual, Christie did not shy away from the dark side of love, even when it came to real estate. I mean, Santonix the architect is probably the most fascinating character in this story, both to the reader and to Mike himself. It's just all about that beautiful house. Postern of Fate does, of course, get an honorable mention for all of the love that Christie lavishes on the Laurels in that novel, which is a stand-in for Ashfield, especially the grounds of Ashfield. And then I will also mention Five Little Pigs and Dead Man's Folly for their, at times, startlingly faithful renderings of Christie's beloved holiday home, Greenway. Okay, so for our 13th category, we are going to tackle a fourth type of love. In addition to Eros, Philia, and Storge, we've got something called agape. It's spelled Ageape, so it looks like agape, but it's pronounced agape, and this is more of a universal love. The love that people have for strangers en masse, or nature, or a country, or God. And while we don't have nearly as much agape in Christie as we do the other forms of love, we do have some. This is the kind of love that inspires political or religious movements. So buckle up, listeners, because I'm about to discuss some thrillers. Let's get to our bronze medalist here, which is Alistair Blunt and the Status Quo in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. This is one of Christie's classic negative depictions of agape. Alistair Blunt is a fat cat who is ensconced in the finance world. He wants to keep things as they are, and he will stop at nothing to remain in power and keep it that way. Christie clearly does not like him or his plan. And on that note, let's just consider our silver medalist, who is Countess Charlotte von Waltzhausen, aka Big Charlotte from Passenger to Frankfurt, and her love affair with neo-fascism, neo-Nazism. This is another classic negative depiction of agape. Even though Alistair Blunt and his idolization of the status quo was no good, Christie really hates it when people claim that they want to do away with the status quo and replace it with something quote-unquote better. Often she'll use the phrase a new heaven and earth when she's making this point. She just does not trust this sort of zealous thinking, and Big Charlotte is one of the more nefarious of the zealots that she depicts in the canon. I should also mention here Edward from They Came to Baghdad. He too is looking to establish a new order, but in that case we have the added layer of Edward essentially being a honey trap of the male variety. Victoria Jones falls for him hard because he's attractive, and from there the story proceeds. So even though Christie is depicting agape in They Came to Baghdad, it's by way of eros, or passionate love. So you know what? I'm going to go ahead and proclaim a tie for the silver medal between Passenger to Frankfurt and They Came to Baghdad, which means this may officially be my least favorite silver medal of the pack. But now, for our gold medalist in this category, we have one of the rare portrayals in Christie of a patriotic zeal done right. And that involves Monsieur Hercule Poirot and England. And this doesn't pertain to any one novel. It's my analysis of the overall, but we are introduced to our dear Poirot as a war refugee who's been taken in by England in his time of need during the First World War. And he appreciates the country that helped him. He will do pretty much anything for England. He has a very strong love of country for this adopted home. I mean, let's put it this way. He will even go to drafty English country houses that don't have central heating in the winter. I mean, if that's not love, I don't know what is. Okay, I have to give a big honorable mention to the Star Over Bethlehem collection, in which Christie proves that she was engaged in lots of agape with her love as a Christian. My frequent guest co-host, the Reverend Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson, has taught us so much about this aspect of Christie's life, and I'm happy to say we still have 2 stories to do within that collection, so more to come on that front. And then finally, I have to mention The Call of Wings, which is the rare story extolling religious devotion that does not appear in the Star Over Bethlehem collection. This one is much weirder than the Christian piety on display in the Star Over Bethlehem stories. If you ever hear someone arguing that Christie was simply a conservative with a capital C, that's all there is to it, tell them to read this story, because it's about a man who has every material item that he could ever desire, but who doesn't achieve true happiness till he gives it all away and lets go of everything. And he achieves this enlightenment by way of a homeless man who has no legs, I should add, and who seems to be an incarnation of the pagan god Pan. There's a lot going on here. But the story is definitely suffused with a religious fervor and love. It's also one of the first stories Christie ever wrote. Okay, we only have 2 categories left. How is this possible? All right, category 14, problematic love, or love stuck in its time. This is an issue that Catherine and I never shied away from when we were ranking Christie, and it certainly comes up when we talk about Christie's depictions of love and loving relationships. So let's get into it. I'm going to award the bronze medal to Ginevra Boynton and Dr. Gerard in Appointment with Death. Ginevra is portrayed to be mentally fragile and in need of medical assistance. So is it a little problematic that she ends up with a doctor who is said to be caring for her? Yes, I think this is potentially not okay, which is why this depiction gets our bronze medal. The silver medal goes to Anne Benningfeld and Harry Lucas, aka John Erdsley, in The Man in the Brown Suit. So I said that we would be talking about The Man in the Brown Suit later. Now is later. You know, listeners, how much Catherine Brobeck and I loved this novel when we covered it on the podcast. But even we had to acknowledge that there were aspects of the relationship between Anne and Harry, their chemistry together, that just doesn't work for us in the here and now. Even though the chemistry between these two is very real, it's phrases like this: "I shall carry you away and beat you black and blue." That's a direct quote from Harry, and it's meant to make us swoon. That's the effect it has on Anne, certainly. It's just a fact that what constitutes romance and chemistry and sexy hijinks has changed a lot over the years. Because of course it has. I mean, The Man in the Brown Suit is now officially over 100 years old. Can you believe that? So it would be shocking if it weren't out of date when it came to such matters. These sorts of things age quickly. And I will just remind you, I am never pointing out these discrepancies as a judgment of Christie, but I do think it's important to point them out and to discuss them. And on that note, I'll bet that some of you can guess which text gets the dreaded gold medal for problematic or stuck in its time depictions of romance. And just a word of warning here that I will be talking about a depiction of domestic abuse right now. Oh yes, we've got the ignominious ending to Taken at the Flood, in which Lynn Marchmont, who has been engaged to Rowley Claude the whole novel and yet bored with him and flirting with the murderous David Hunter, finally gets her happy ending with Rowley after all. It's another love rescued from the brink, and how is it rescued? By Rowley attempting to strangle her to death. It's so unfortunate because this book has so much going for it otherwise, and I completely understand what Christie is trying to do here. I really do, but no. Just no. I've got an honorable mention for Dr. Stillingfleet and Norma Restarek in Third Girl. This is a bit of a Ginevra and Dr. Gerard situation repeating itself. Also, the unnamed narrator in the short story In a Glass Darkly pulls himself back from the brink of strangling his wife to death. This was a premonition that he had seen himself years earlier, though he was unable to recognize himself in the premonition. But now he has, and he's going to mend his ways, and we're to believe that he and his wife will live happily ever after? Sure. And there are other depictions that I could pull apart, but you know what? I am too excited about my final category because in some ways I've saved the best for last, listeners. It is time to discuss what I am calling true love. This final category is not for couples who we see coming together over the course of the story, but for those couples who are presented to us as rock solid and very much in love, and for whom this love never changes. Call them the Coach and Tammy Taylor of the Christieverse. If that analogy works for you, it works for me. The love between these characters is one of the foundations upon which these stories rest, and that makes them crucial. I'm actually going to start with my honorable mentions for this category so that I can end on the high, the delicious high of my gold medalists. So in terms of some of the rock-solid couples we come across in Christie, we've got Colonel Despard and Rhoda Dawes, who we see happily married in The Pale Horse. We, of course, also saw them get together in Cards on the Table. Love an internovel romance. We've also got Alistair Ravenscroft and his wife Margaret, and to some extent his sister-in-law Dorothea as well. He loves Dorothea too, in Elephants Can Remember. The Bantrys, Colonel and Dolly Bantry, who appear in multiple stories, and how heartbreaking is it when we learn in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side that Dolly Bantry is now a widow. Love the Bantrys. Let us never forget Henrietta Savernake and John Christo in The Hollow. They are a rare non-married rock-solid pair, especially since John is married, but to a murderer. It actually pains me that I can't give Henrietta and John a medal because they are such an exquisitely drawn couple. And then two more, the Andrenies in Murder on the Orient Express and the Summer Hazes in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. Lovely couples, all of those. But let's talk now about our even lovelier medalists. First up, our bronze medal goes to Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd from A Murder is Announced, and oh, how it pleases me that one of our rock-solid couples is a same-sex couple, listeners. I talked a lot about this on my Gaze of Agatha Christie episode, but there is so much that Christie gets right here in her depiction of this loving lesbian couple. There is no question that these two are in love and remain in love. Till one of them dies, of course. Sniff. They're just wonderful. All right, our silver medal goes to Leonard and Griselda Clement from The Murder at the Vicarage. You didn't think I could close out an episode on love and not mention these lovebirds, did you? Leonard and Griselda, seriously, are one of the very best married couples ever depicted in Christie. They're a big reason why I tell people Five Little Pigs may be the best Agatha Christie novel, but my personal favorite Agatha Christie novel is The Murder at the Vicarage. I mean, mostly that has to do with Miss Marple, but it also has a lot to do with the Clements. And I'm stealing this from Sophie Hannah, who has trotted this out before when extolling Christie's characterization. But how great is the reason behind why Griselda chose Leonard? Because Griselda is young and beautiful, and Leonard is older, and he's a stuffy vicar. But the reason Griselda chose him is that he couldn't help himself from loving her. He didn't want to fall in love with her. He tried hard, knowing, in fact, what a bad fit she would be at the vicarage. What a mess that it would be. And it is a mess. But he couldn't help himself. And so for this reason, clever Griselda said yes. And the rest is history, because they might be a mess, but they are in love. And it's till death do us part for these two. There's just no question. Long live the Clements. And I didn't want to mention any of the other rock-solid ecclesiastical couples we have in the canon before I mentioned the Clements, because I didn't want to give the game away. But I should mention Julian and Diana Bunch Harmon of Chipping Cleghorn, as well as Caleb and Maud Dane Calthrop, first of Limstock and later, can you blame them for hightailing it out of Limstock, of Much Deeping. And no surprise in Christie that men of the cloth and their wives tend to have good marriages. It's the Anglican way, right? Queried this Catholic Irishman with a mischievous grin on his face. All right. It is time now, my dear listeners, to crown my gold medalists in the category of true love. I have a feeling many of you know who these two are. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the greatness of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Now, to be fair, Tommy and Tuppence could also fit into the let's get together category, since we do watch them reconnect and fall in love over the course of The Secret Adversary, which is the first novel in which they appear. But I selfishly wanted to save them for the end of my episode, because I think when we're talking about love in Agatha Christie, they are just the tops. After The Secret Adversary, we are privileged to watch Tommy and Tuppence over the course of one short story collection and 3 more novels grow old and have children together, and then grow super old together. And while Miss Marple does age, especially later in the canon, this quality of the Beresfords, their very frailty and humanness, the fact that they are just like you and me, is what sets them apart as detective protagonists in the Christie canon. We can feel Christie putting so much of her own self and relationships into her depiction of the Beresfords. And I have actually never aired this theory before, but I personally believe there is a very good reason we have such long gaps between Tommy and Tuppence stories in the oeuvre. So here's my theory. When Christie first started writing this pair, she was obviously thinking about herself and Archie. Archie and Agatha, Tommy and Tuppence. We all see what she did there. And so she wrote The Secret Adversary, and then very swiftly after that, she wrote those larky stories that were collected into Partners in Crime. Almost all of those were written in 1924, even though the collection came out much later. And then her marriage fell apart. And I think the last thing Christie wanted to do in the aftermath of the disappearance and her divorce, and then even her second marriage to Max Mallowan, as happy as that occasion was, I think the last thing she wanted to do was to revisit Tommy and Tuppence, who were the fictional Archie and Agatha. So she let a lot of years go by till the country was at war, and then she put them into a wartime adventure in NRM in 1941. Fair enough. But after that, nada. For years and years and years. And she admitted that fans would ask her about them all the time. But she refused to deliver until we get to By the Pricking of My Thumbs, all the way in 1968. And by that point, Tommy and Tuppence are an old married couple. And guess what? Max and Agatha were an old couple by then too. So I think it had become an easier fit, once again, for Christie to embrace this married couple who she couldn't help comparing to herself and her husband. And perhaps that is why she revisited them again so soon with 1973's Postern of Fate, which was the last novel that she would write. It's just a theory, but it makes sense to me on an emotional level. And I find it moving because it means that so much of what Christie shows us about the love that exists between Tommy and Tuppence, her married detectives, comes from her own experience and from her own heart. And that, my friends, is beautiful. And I'm going to say it now for the final time, listeners, and this time I really mean it. Happy Valentine's Day. Well, that was all about love in Agatha Christie. I had a lot of fun reviewing the canon with a bit of a different lens to look through. I hope you all enjoyed that, and I hope that you send me some comments. It's always fun to hear from you when I do one of these omnibus episodes. It helps clear out the cobwebs a little bit, re-engage with our Christie, get back to basics. For my next episode, I will finally be delivering to you The Cats of Agatha Christie, so get excited. Until then, shoot me an email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, or you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame or on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can also access bonus episodes of the podcast on Patreon. I've included a link to Patreon in the show notes. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Author, or just click on the link to my website or on any of the links that I have provided in the show notes for the purchase of my latest mystery novel, Loose Lips. or to listen to either of those podcast interviews I did recently on my book. And please come visit me while I'm on tour back east. I hope to see some of you out on the trail. Alternately, give me a rating and or a review. You don't have to go out on any sort of a trail to do that. It's always appreciated, as is any of the support so many of you have provided to me and the podcast. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Bye.